Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Massive crowds express support for the Yemeni revolution and Taiz. Jordanian protesters demand reforms and an end to corruption. And Israeli soldiers caught on tape abusing Palestinian prisoners. Mosaic. World news from the Middle East begins now.
استشهد 5 يمنيين بينهم فتاة في قصف واشتباك.
5 Yemenis, including a young woman, were martyred in renewed shelling and clashes in the city of Taiz, south of the capital of Sana'a. The death toll from the clashes with forces loyal to Saleh has risen to 20 martyrs. Local sources confirmed that 3 people were martyred during a funeral procession for the martyrs killed in yesterday's shelling. An army tank was set ablaze near the local municipal building in western Taiz. A young woman named Noria al-Humeri was martyred Thursday evening during a shelling that targeted al-Rauda neighborhood and areas adjacent to Taiz Freedom Square, where protesters are staging sit-ins. In the capital Sana'a, hundreds of thousands of Yemenis took to the streets for the Friday of Independence rallies. The demonstrators demanded the trial of President Ali Abdullah Saleh and condemned a campaign of crackdowns launched by government forces against civilians. The protesters renewed their rejection of all political settlements, including the Riyadh Agreement. Meanwhile, consultation efforts are intensifying between the joint meeting parties and the ruling party for the official announcement of the formation of the government.
These were the chants of Yemeni protesters marking the Friday of Independence in commemoration of cleansing the country of colonization on November 30th, 1967. The youths of the revolution celebrated the event in their own way, just like they have on previous occasions. They wanted to send a message that they are capable of cleansing Yemen of Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime.
Our message is that we are capable of uprooting the tyrant Ali Abdullah Saleh and his aides, just like our parents and grandparents did with the British occupation. We are almost there, God willing.
The revolutionary squares are not far from the headquarters of the politicians who are leading consultation efforts aimed at forming a coalition government and implementing articles of the Riyadh Agreement. However, it seems that this political mobilization has failed so far to meet the objectives of the revolutionaries who come from all walks of life.
We demand the trial of the butcher. In light of the bloodshed, we reject any dialogue, negotiation, or power-sharing deal.
We came out for the sake of building a new Yemen, for freedom and dignity, and for the trial of butchers.
Yemeni children are sharing the same dreams and ambitions as grown-ups. In an unprecedented scene, the entire Yemeni family has converged on revolutionary squares to demand change, as many began to realize that a new Yemen is about to form. It seems that the entire Yemeni family has realized that revolutionary action is the only choice to build the country and reclaim freedom, equality, and dignity for a nation that has suffered for a long time. Ali Al-Dab Al-Allam from Sitin Square in Sana'a.
Jordanian Prime Minister Aoun al-Hassauna won a parliamentary vote of confidence with 89 votes. On the other hand, the popular mobilization took to the street today, on Friday, to demand more political and economic reforms in Jordan.
Vibrant speeches were heard in the Jordanian parliament for 4 days, shortly before the government of the International Court of Justice Judge Aoun Kassauna gained parliament's vote of confidence. Some parliament members' statements strongly criticized the government and the contents of its ministerial statement. One of them did not forget to criticize parliament. So this parliament is completely like a male bee. It dies after finishing its mission.
Meanwhile,
Others went as far as demanding the expulsion of opposition leaders from the country.
Hamza Mansour, Saeed, Irshad, Ahmed Ibadat, Zubi, I'm asking you before God to leave the country. Leave the country.
It led to some skirmishes. Many of the representatives' demands centered on services as the Prime Minister responded to the representatives' speeches. He stressed the necessity of delegating his government the task of tackling corruption.
In the ministerial statement, I emphasized the extreme importance for the government to fight corruption and punish the corrupt.
The government was expected to gain the parliamentary vote of confidence in light of the absence of the political opposition's representatives in the incumbent parliament after they boycotted the latest parliamentary elections. Kasauna's winning of the parliamentary vote of confidence was not unexpected, but it does not mean popular protests will end across the kingdom's provinces. The ministerial statement did not please the opposition, nor does the political opposition have faith in the members of the incumbent parliament. The opposition says the popular mobilization, with all of its political and union components, will continue protesting at every given chance, as long as the opposition's demands are not met and the government does not respond to their aspirations.
This movement does not have any trust in this tribal parliament. There is no policy. Did you hear any policy discussion between the ministers and prime minister and parliament today? There is no policy. The movement is politicized. It does not take this parliament into consideration.
It seems the Jordanian opposition, with all of its political, tribal, and union components, is moving forward with an approach that rejects the performance of Jordan's successive governments. The opposition says political reforms are out of reach. Nasser Shadid, BBC, Amman. Dozens of Egyptian activists organized a protest that was launched from Mustafa Mahmoud Mosque and headed to Tahrir Square in central Cairo. Demonstrators demanded that those involved in the attack on Tahrir Square's protesters be held accountable. This comes as the number of participants dwindled in the million-person march that was called for by some of the revolution's coalitions in central Cairo today. The decrease is viewed as a ramification of the positive environment that dominated the first round of Egyptian parliamentary elections. In the same context, support for the military council was expressed in al-Assad Square.
They are still chanting against the military council despite their 2-week-long protest in Tahrir Square. The effects of the parliamentary elections, in which millions participated, resonated in the square. The revolution's youth called for a protest dubbed the Right of the Martyrs, but there was a noticeable decrease in the number of participants. The revolutionaries held Friday prayers with the revolution's orator reflecting on the electoral scene.
I thank those who secured these elections, headed by this great people. We are the ones who protected the parliamentary elections.
The goals of Tahrir's revolutionaries united, and it became clear that demanding those goals must continue.
Whenever we say anything, the military council imposes someone on us, be it Ganzouri or Sharaf.
We came here today to protest Ganzouri's government. We don't want military rule. Everything the military council is doing is an attempt to prolong and reproduce the Mubarak regime.
Protesters here in Tahrir Square are demanding the military cede its political and executive powers to a national salvation government that would be elected by the square. As for over there, in al-Assad Square, they have different demands. For the second consecutive time, al-Assad Square was the stage for a demonstration that held thousands of the military council's backers who support al-Ganzouri's government, especially after the council vowed to grant it the powers needed to carry out its duties.
We support all of the military council's decisions, whether it's assigning Ganzouri or anyone else. We support the council's decision.
Removed from al-Abbasiyya and Tahrir, Egyptians engaged in debates estimating parliamentary elections will continue, viewing them as a step toward ending the transitional period. Mahmoud Hassin, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
14 people have been killed so far by Assad's brigades in massive demonstrations that swept across Syrian cities under the slogan, "We demand a buffer zone." In Deir ez-Zor, Jableh, the Khalidiyya neighborhood of Homs, Hasaka, Idlib, al-Asali, Amuda, Marat al-Naman, and Jabal al-Zawiya, the protesters had one voice calling for freedom and demanding that Bashar al-Assad and his regime leave. Meanwhile, Takalach is still suffering from the Syrian killing machine as its neighborhoods are subject to violent artillery shelling.
The Friday of We Demand a Buffer Zone is the new theme the Syrian opposition gave its protests that erupted today to demand the downfall of the regime. In light of the killing and torture the protesters have been enduring.
December 2nd, security officers and Shabiha stormed Sakba on the Friday of We Demand a Buffer Zone.
Shelling and arrest campaigns were carried out against citizens, including a number of lawyers in Syria, such as Abdussalam al-Atrash in Damascus. Syrian human rights organizations indicated in a statement that Hussam al-Assad, a member of the Lawyers Guild in Idlib, has been detained for nearly a week. Meanwhile, lawyer Ali Badran's office and home were raided in Tel Rifat. And as usual, al-Assad's brigades mobilized and besieged neighborhoods, shut down entrances, and encircled mosques in various areas, including Al-Kabun neighborhood of Damascus, to prevent protests from taking place. Meanwhile, the Shabiha patrol units are deployed on all main streets. In Deir ez-Zor, the Syrian security forces besieged Urfi Mosque to deter any protests. At the same time, intensive security deployment was witnessed and all mosques in Jableh were encircled to prevent the worshippers from coming out to protest. Homs, as usual, rose up today even though its mosques are besieged. More than 4,000 protesters took to the streets in Al-Qusur neighborhood, demanding a buffer zone to protect civilians and the downfall of the regime. In Al-Khalidiyya of Homs, a massive protest broke out. Demonstrators demanded that Assad and his regime leave. Al-Assad's brigades responded to them by burning their houses amid a tight siege on the area. Meanwhile, security forces fired tear gas at protesters in Hama, specifically in Al-Amiriyya neighborhood amid heavy gunfire. A massive protest also broke out in Al-Azadi square of Hasaka, calling for freedom and the execution of al-Assad and demanding a buffer zone. A massive protest also broke out in Azadi square of Hasaka, calling for freedom and the execution of Assad and demanding a buffer zone. In addition, the regions of Idlib, al-Asali, Amuda, Ma'arrat al-Na'man, and other Syrian towns witnessed massive demonstrations.
In Bahrain, protests against the Al-Khalifa regime continue across the tiny Persian Gulf island. Protesters took to the streets of Mahaza village in the island of Sitra. They rallied against the monarchy system that's ruled Bahrain for 2 centuries. The protesters are calling for the downfall of the regime and demanded a democratic system to take over. With support from Saudi Arabia, the regime in Manama has launched a brutal crackdown on anti-regime protesters since mid-February. Scores of people have been killed, injured, and detained since then. People across Pakistan have taken to the streets to voice their anger over the US and NATO's airstrikes in the country. The protesters were out in Islamabad, Quetta, and Karachi, where they marched outside the U.S. consulate. They also burned the U.S. flag. They demanded an end to cross-border air raids by NATO.
army is under attack. That shows that Pakistan is in a state of war. It is our message out to the citizens of Pakistan, to the world outside, that Pakistan is in a state of war and the citizens of Pakistan are not dead. They are awake, wide awake, watching all of it, aware of this, and we are going to step out for our rights, and we're going to fight for our rights every time that it's needed.
One of those strikes killed 24 Pakistani soldiers last week. 24 Pakistani soldiers were also killed in the same attack. Pakistan has condemned the strike as a violation of its territory. Islamabad has blocked supply routes for US-led forces in Afghanistan in protest against the strike. Meanwhile, police in Britain have arrested 22 people outside the US Embassy in London during a protest against Washington over the same issue. The protest was aimed at drawing attention to US airstrikes, including drone attacks. Protesters in Turkey have burned the US and Britain's flags for their efforts to impose further sanctions on Iran. Hundreds of protesters demonstrated in the Turkish city of Istanbul against the US and Britain. They carried banners bearing slogans against Washington and London for their roles in the Afghanistan war. The protest comes as US Vice President Joe Biden visits Turkey. During his meetings with Turkish officials, Biden has called for further sanctions on Iran over its nuclear energy program. The demonstrators have also protested against Biden's visit and chanted slogans against the US.
US Vice President Joe Biden has arrived in Ankara for talks with Turkish leaders that are reportedly focused on the situation in Syria, joint measures against Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, and Iran's nuclear program. Biden's first meeting was held with Turkey's Parliament Speaker Cemal Çiçek. The US Vice President, in his talks with Turkish officials, hailed Turkey's sanctions on Syrian government and reportedly called on Turkey to impose sanctions against Iran. Turkey, which has strong cultural and trade ties with Iran, has been traditionally against Iran sanctions. Earlier this week, Turkey declared sanctions against Syria, including banning sale of weapons to Syria and suspending interaction with Syria's central bank. Efforts to mend strained ties between Turkey and the main US ally in the Middle East, Israel, has been reportedly on the agenda in Biden's talks with Turkish officials. Biden's visit to Ankara comes as the US has been royally watching the estrangement of Turkey and Israel after 9 Turkish nationals were killed in an Israeli attack on a Gaza-bound flotilla last year. Ankara has repeatedly stated that relations between Turkey and Israel will not normalize unless Tel Aviv apologizes for the attack on the flotilla and pays compensation to the relatives of the victims of the attack.
The US wants cordial ties between Turkey and Israel, which are its allies in the Middle East. But in order to mend such ties, the US should talk to Israel, not Turkey, because Ankara has clearly declared its conditions for normalization of ties with Israel.
Biden also held talks with Turkish President Abdullah Gül. Joint measures against the PKK were reportedly discussed during the meeting. The US move to increase its cooperation with Turkey comes as the US will withdraw its forces from Iraq in less than a month, and Turkey seems open to stronger intelligence and military ties with the US.
The US is pulling its forces out of Iraq and is now looking for some trustable and powerful allies in the region. And the top option for the US is now Turkey. Ankara also seeks strong measures by the US against the PKK.
We open with new efforts of the international community to block Iran's disputed nuclear development program. By unanimous vote, the United States Senate approved tougher sanctions against any global financial institutions that continue to conduct business with Tehran's central bank, which is the main conduit for Iranian oil revenues. Similar provisions have already been passed in the U.S. House of Representatives, which now increases the likelihood that a version of the bill will be sent to U.S. President Barack Obama to either sign into law or veto the measure. White House officials have cautioned that the perceived threat against international companies may not be the most successful way of obtaining the support of U.S. allies in action against Iran, saying that while the Obama administration is looking to sanction Iran's central bank, the effort must come in a calibrated manner to avoid aggravating oil markets or the antagonizing of U.S. allies. The European Union is also undertaking increased action against Iran. At a meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels, the body agreed to draft new sanctions targeting Tehran's energy, transportation, and financial sectors, but also stopped short of formally pledging to consider an embargo against Iranian oil. The EU did add 180 Iranian individuals and entities involved in nuclear development to a sanctions blacklist, freezing their assets and imposing a ban on travel. The eventual passing of any sanctions will require the unanimous approval of all 27 member states. Europe has now increased its own focus on instituting stiffer economic sanctions, as it now appears likely that Russia and China will attempt to block similar measures undertaken by the United Nations Security Council. EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton said that fears of several member states that the imposition of an oil embargo against Iran could harm their own economies will be assessed by technical experts.
What we agreed in the meeting was that, and you'll see the actual text of the conclusions, was to look at a range of issues, including the energy sector. But the detail of exactly what should be done now goes into the technical experts who decide what will work, what is appropriate for European Union member states to do, and what will have what effect on Iran. So those issues are being debated.
These moves against Tehran come as Iranian diplomats are now preparing to leave Great Britain just hours before the expiration of a deadline for their expulsion demanded by the United Kingdom in retaliation of attacks against the British Embassy in Tehran. At this hour, some 24 diplomats are expected to fly out of Heathrow Airport aboard a specially chartered flight of the Islamic Republic's official Iran air carrier.
Israel's TV Channel 2 aired a video showing 2 Palestinian prisoners being mistreated during their detainment. The channel confirmed the occupation soldiers who committed the crime have not been arrested. Anas Abu Arqub reports.
Soldiers of what is said to be the oasis of democracy in the Middle East carry out their daily practice of abusing citizens. But this time, some images made their way to media organizations.
Why are you causing problems for the army? Huh?
It wasn't me, it was my friends.
No, you're a liar.
My friends are causing problems, not me.
The slap is from me to your friends, son of a bitch. We'll break your legs and hands because you're causing us problems.
These images were found by accident on the cell phones of occupation army soldiers who were arrested by the military police for crimes committed against Israelis.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For the love of God, I'm dying. I'm dying. For the love of God.
The soldiers who were arrested and on whose phones these images we found were not the ones who carried out the abuse, nor were they the ones who captured these images. Reduced charges were filed against the soldiers who had these videos, and they were only jailed for a few months. The military police did not force these soldiers to reveal how they obtained the videos. No one knows the identity of these prisoners who endure torture, but the reality confirms that this scene is repeated day and night by the occupation soldiers.
Joining us directly from Ramallah is Mr. Shawan Jabarin, the General Director of Al-Haq Human Rights Organization. Good evening, Mr. Shawan.
Good evening.
Did you watch the report? What barbarity!
This is a daily policy and a daily practice. This incident is not an exception to the usual practices of the occupation soldiers and the various authorities of the security agencies. So, I'm not surprised. I have goosebumps after seeing this practice, but we have also tasted it on our own skin, and all Palestinians have experienced it. Be it workers trying to reach their workplaces, detainees under investigation, children when they're caught in demonstrations against the wall, etc. I think this is the policy of the occupation authority. But right now we focus on these cases because they have been revealed, and I believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The real picture is broader.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincoat Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Now on US airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories. World news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.